This is a Roqe series, The Contemporary History of Iran, Part 1. Hi there, welcome to The Contemporary History of Iran, a series from Roqe Media. This is part 1, From Shahyad to Azadi. I'm Jian Ghomeshi. Our aim with this series is to explore the events, personalities, and issues that have shaped modern Iran. We want to do this as much as possible through a non-traditional lens, through snapshots of change and using alternative voices or angles. This series is mostly in English and will feature a new episode posted every Thursday across our Roqe Media platforms. We will post subtitled versions with Persian Zirnevis on our YouTube and Instagram sites. We are coming to you on roqemedia.com. It is there that you can link to all of our platforms. We're on an ongoing mission to build a new audiovisual encyclopedia of Iranian diaspora identity. You can find this program on Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Instagram, Castbox, and Telegram, as well as YouTube. Here now is The Contemporary History of Iran, Part 1. Imagine a legendary symbol representing almost all things to do with a nation that almost overnight morphs into a symbol for the opposite of what it stood for. What if it's an actual building, an identifiable monument in the middle of a capital city? What kind of precedent is there for such a change? Well, if you visited Iran in the 1970s, you would likely have wanted to see the symbol of beautiful architecture in Tehran, the Maydan-e Shahyad, as it was known then, an iconic structure that literally referenced the monarchy. But if you visited Iran today, you would still witness the same structure in all of its glory, except now you would be visiting the Maydan-e Azadi, Freedom Square. And now it's somehow a symbol of an Islamic Republic. What is the story of how this essential monument of modern Iran that features a design influenced by both pre- and post-Islamic architecture transformed, at least in identity, after a revolution? This is the question for our inaugural edition of Roqe's Contemporary History of Iran series. And for this discussion, I'm joined by Dr. Talinn Grigor. Talinn is a professor and chair of the Art History program at the University of California, Davis. She was born and raised in Iran. She moved to California at the age of 14, where she's been living since. Talinn's research focuses on 19th and 20th century art and architectural histories through the framework of post-colonial and critical theories grounded in Iran and Parsi India. Her books include Building Iran, Modernism, Architecture, and National Heritage under the Pahlavi Monarchs, Contemporary Iranian Art from the Street to the Studio, and The Persian Revival, The Imperialism of the Copy in Iranian and Parsi Architecture. That's from 2021. Her work has appeared in countless magazines and academic journals, and she's held residential fellowships at the National Gallery of Art, the Getty Research Institute, and Cornell and Princeton universities. And right now, Talinn Grigor joins me from Davis, California. Hello.
Hi, Jian. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for doing this. It is confounding to me. It's so interesting to me, and I'm going to ask you in a few moments whether there are other historical examples like this, that a symbol, that a building that is so iconic, so relatable to a certain era of a country can transform to become the symbol of another era of the country. But let me start here. What can you tell us about why this tower was initially built and perhaps the original significance of it?
Well, that's an excellent question. I mean, that's basically you're asking a question about the history of architecture, how monuments change their meaning. in accordance to who is writing their history. One of the great examples of that kind of change in meaning is, for example, Hagia Sophia. And the Shahyad monument is a great example in the Iranian case. It was originally, they started the construction in 1966 when Etelat, the most important newspaper in Iran, announced a national competition where there were 20 entries. It was limited to only Iranian architects, so that was already a very important thing that Westerners, especially Western architects, couldn't participate in this competition. And there were 20 entries, and eventually this proposal was accepted, and it was realized by October 1971.
And it was built as the translation of Maydan-e Shahyad is the remembrance of the Shahs, right? The square of the remembrance of the Shahs. Was that the idea? I mean, I guess it was.
Yes, absolutely. So the monument was built for on the occasion of the 2,500-year anniversary, where Mohammad Reza Shah's government put together. They actually worked on it for almost a decade. And eventually, in October 1971, there was this grand celebration at Persepolis where all the major heads of states were invited to Shiraz and Persepolis. Some ceremonies took place at Persepolis and Pasargada. And then when the invitees were flown into Tehran, the events reopened at the foot of this monument. So from the very beginning, this monument was supposed to mean the very long history of Persian monarchy. It was supposed to connect the ancient, the Persepolis and the Achaemenids, to the Pahlavi monarchy. So architecture became a link between the ancient and the modern, the contemporary. And so the name, the form, the rituals around it, all of them were meant in 1971 to signal 2,500 years of Iranian monarchy, the very tradition of kingship in Iran, which is central to how Iran's history, how Iran has been governed.
You know, I remember Professor Abbas Milani writing about this. I just had the occasion to reread the Shah, his book, in speaking to him a few months back, and I remember him talking about the Maydan-e Shahyad, this monument. And so I went back and looked at what he said, and he says Shahyad was a gateway to the future and a celebration of the past, which is what you're saying. I see how it was that spiritually. Is it that, or was it that architecturally as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So the monument is designed by Hossein Amanat, who was an architectural student at the University of Tehran School of Fine Arts. And so if you look at the form of the monument, the way that it has a central arch, and then it evolves, but the arch itself evolves in multiple ways to refer to the different periods in Iranian history. First of all, the very notion of the triumphal arch, the Roman triumphal arch, has been revolutionized, has been modernized, where you see a gate. This is something I argued in my master's thesis almost 20 years ago, where this is very typical of modernist gate, because it's not really, it doesn't open, it doesn't close, it doesn't control anything, but it is very much a gate through which we can imagine ourselves to be Iranian. It is the gate through which, and the Shah talked about the Tamaddon-e Bozorg, and he kept talking about how we are at the gates of this great civilization, that we are just about to leap into the future, this kind of utopian society, modern society that he was creating. And Shahyad becomes that gate through which Iranians were encouraged to imagine the upcoming great civilization that they are living through. So the monument itself has a reference to the Triumphal Arch. It has a reference in its form. It has a reference to the Parthian fire temples, the Chartag. It certainly refers, the opening itself is actually a copy of the Sasanian Avon from Ctesiphon, that being the Ctesiphon Palace being the last Sasanian monarch left from the Ctesiphon Palace, and that's when the Sasanian Empire fell and ended. But it also, I mean, Hossein Amanat did a great job of synthesizing. It wasn't just the pre-Islamic, just the Zoroastrian, Mazdaic references, but also it refers to the Seljuk tomb towers. And then eventually at the top of the arch, you're seeing the Safavid Muqarnas work. And all of this is put together in a way that at the end, the building, the monument is a modernist monument.
Yeah. It's quite a feat, I just parenthetically, I mean, I there's something magical about it, at least in the last time I was in Iran, I was 5 years old, so I don't remember a lot other than, visiting family and Canada Dry and a few things like that. But I do remember the Azadi Tower. I mean, I remember it, and I remember it being kind of magical. I mean, did it have that impression upon you as a kid when you were there, long before you became an expert in architecture?
Not as a child, but when I did go back for my dissertation research, obviously, I saw it as an adult, as a sort of scholar in training, as a student of architecture, and that was very impressive and magical. But what I find fascinating about this building is the way that it keeps the form. We see Shahyad exactly as it was built in 1971. But the layering of its meaning.
Yes.
So the way that you introduced it in the beginning, this represented the Shah, as if sort of it replaces the body of the Shah.
Yes.
But then during the revolution, the 2 years of the revolution between 77 and 79, it had a completely different meaning for the people who were using it as an anti-Shah, as the centerpiece of their anti-Shah protest.
Well, let me actually cut you off there, and because that's exactly where I wanted to go with this. And before we get to what happens in the aftermath of the revolution, let me ask you about what you've just said, because in a broader discussion of how this building gets reframed throughout history and whatever the language is that you would use around buildings like this, was there already, I mean, given the original intent and symbolism and meaning of this monument, was there already a paradox at work? Was there already a paradox happening when it becomes one of the epicenters of anti-Shah protests in the lead up to the revolution?
Yes. So the paradox is that it's not just the monument and how it looks and how it stands. It's the larger Pahlavi urbanism and going back to Reza Shah. So if we remember the 1920s, late 20s, 1930s, Reza Shah destroyed 11 of the 12 gates of Qajar, Tehran. So on Reza Shah's part, that was a modernization effort to get rid of the walls, to get the fortification walls that Nasser-Din Shah had erected, to get rid of these city gates, what the Pahlavi elite in the 30s perceived as regressive medieval urbanism. And only one gate was left. And the other thing that Reza Shah did was these extremely large boulevards that went north and south and east and west. And one of them was Shah Reza Avenue that extended, and then it was further extended in the 60s. And so in Mohammad Reza Shah's effort and his urban planners to solve some of the problems that Tehran had, urban problems that Tehran had, which was that it kept growing north and south, And if you know the topography of Tehran, there is so much you can extend north and south, because in the north you have the mountain ranges, and in the south you have the desert. So Mohammad Reza Shah's urban designers, they started to expand Tehran eastward and westward. And the design of Shahyad was one of these efforts to extend Tehran and encourage the increasing population to move towards the east and the west. Huh. So the very design of this, the biggest open urban square in East Tehran, was part of that larger effort that started in the late 20s. So the fact that you had these extremely large boulevards like Shah Reza that then connects to one of the biggest open urban squares, at the center of which stands this monument, itself was conducive to large gatherings, large protests. And so people, the protesters and their leaders, it was almost sort of logical that they would march on Shah Reza Avenue and then gather in this larger open square. So the fact that the Shah wanted something grand, something majestic, something open, so the biggest, the largest, that same intention, that same royal intention, then lends itself to be used by anti-Shah movement for the same purpose. They too want somewhere big, somewhere to gather, all of them collectively experience this uprising.
It's fascinating. And it wasn't lost on them that this was the Maydan-e Shahyad, I can imagine, too, if they're protesting outside of it. There's a series, I don't know if you've seen it, it's on Amazon Prime or something now, called The Man in the High Castle, and it's based on a Philip Roth novel, or it's a reimagining of the world if the Nazis had won World War II. And so in America, one thing that they do is they tear down the Statue of Liberty, right? This is the iconic symbol of America. Let's tear it down. So it's so curious to me that given that this was such a monument to the monarchy, I mean, it was literally called the Remembrance of the Shahyad Square, that it was designed by a member of the Baha'i faith, Hossein Amanat, as you mentioned. Why was it not shuttered or torn down or somehow destroyed like so many other vestiges of the Shah era when the Islamic formalists consolidate power in the years after the revolution?
So my argument for that has two reasons. One was that Azadi Square and the monument itself were central to the success of the revolution. I believe that, I've argued that it's precisely in this extremely large urban open space that could accommodate 2 million people. So, for example, on November 10th, 1978, Shahyad Square could accommodate 2 million protesters at once. Right. And on top of that, the fact that the monument itself is this kind of central tower with these extended wings on which people could express their anti-royalist sentiments. So on the monument itself, that is called Shahyad, and it's for the memory of the Shah, protesters could actually write "death to the Shah." So the monument allows this kind of popular resistance. People were climbing on the wings and going up, and in order to put posters and flags and protest boards on the monument. On top of that, the media could broadcast the revolution from the monument itself. So you had journalists who could film and so the presence of the monument in its large landscaped urban space, my argument has that it enabled this kind of protest. Right. And from revolutionary history, we know this. For example, from the French Revolution and then Haussmannian urban reforms in Paris, we know that they created extremely large boulevards in Paris because the French Revolution was undermined. So I really think that there is a correlation between the design of the square and the success of the revolution. So when the revolution ended and the Islamic Republic came to power through a referendum, the monument had already shifted its meaning.
Yeah.
And the fact that Hossein Amanat was a Baha'i was a little bit at that point irrelevant, in part because 1970s Iran, 1960s, 70s Iran was extremely cosmopolitan. I mean, you had all sorts of artists and architects and singers and filmmakers, and it was an extremely diverse society in terms of who was Muslim, who was Baha'i, who was Christian, who was Jewish. And although there was an announcement for his arrest and he fled the country, afterwards, once the Islamic Republic was established, I think it was much more important to the authorities to maintain the monument and change its meaning through further rituals than actually to destroy it. If they had destroyed the monument, they would have destroyed the revolutionary legacy, or actually a part of the revolution.
Yeah, you really have stimulated my mind with this because it's fascinating. Because, in other words, it wasn't just that it was a benign structure or a blank canvas that could be reframed. You're arguing it was actually it was a player in the revolution, and it was fundamental to the revolution, this building, this square.
I'm an architectural historian. I absolutely believe that.
Yeah. So how does it officially become reframed, as you were just intimating, to become the symbol of the new Islamic Republic of Iran? When does it get crowned Azadi Square, etc.?
So almost after the revolution, sort of almost immediately after the revolution, the name was changed. Immediately you had different sets of plaques here and there referring to the Azadi Square. During the revolution itself, it was very important that this was a space of freedom, this fazae baz siyasi, which was sort of practice. So immediately it was called Azadi. There were very minor changes to some of the lower reliefs. In one of the reliefs, you actually see the prince, and then that was sort of covered up and painted. But otherwise, the building remained intact for about 15 years after the revolution. It was a little bit neglected. There wasn't much of a collection or exhibitions in there. So they left it like that. They, in a way, left it to have that effect of changed meaning. And then it was later on more when, during Khatami's period, where cultural activities were sponsored by the state, that the square and the monument became a little bit more active. But the most important ritual that happens there every year at the anniversary of the revolution, around the square with official military parades and speeches by the president each year, that is the real time, the annual ritual where the meaning of the revolutionary meaning of the Azadi is reinforced by the state. And it's published in both international media and in local media, and you always see the monument in the background of these soldiers marching and parading.
You know, this transformation, and when you say proudly that you're an architectural historian, let me test you on that and ask you about, to give me some global context on this, because I was trying to think off the top of my head about historical sites that have changed hands in a similar way. I was thinking of the Angkor Wat temples in Siem Reap, Cambodia, that were originally built as Hindu temples and are now icons of Buddhism. But how often do we see, you mentioned Hagia Sophia, how often do we see what happened with the Shahyad Azadi Tower in the modern era?
I think in general, my argument is that in general, if a monument is architecturally and urbanistically is a successful architecture. It's an architecture that works. It's a building that works. You can live in it. You can experience a sense of harmony and proportion. And so if there are certain architectural qualities to it that are considered workable qualities, aesthetic qualities, tectonic and structural qualities, then their transformation of meaning becomes much easier. And we have in the modern case, especially 19th, 20th century and 21st century transformation, the whole culture of reuse, renovation and reuse, factories that turn into these fancy lofts, for example.
Right.
Again, as long as the building stands, as long as there's nothing more attractive than a hefty I-beam, for example. It all depends. I mean, again, it has to be taken case by case. It has to depend on those who are custodians of these monuments, how they approach it, how they manage to actually preserve it structurally, how they manage to be committed to its aesthetic integrity, structural integrity, decorative integrity, but also how they change its narrative through external means. So, for example, in the case of Azadi, the Islamic Republic could have easily sort of completely painted over it. It could have destroyed it. There was this rumor that on top of it, there are these window openings at the very top of the towers. And supposedly there's a certain number, 7 or 9, I don't remember now, that is a Baha'i symbol. So there were rumors that, Hossein Amanat had implanted these covert Baha'i symbols in the Shahyad. And Islamic Republic could have easily sort of chopped off the top of it. But they didn't. I mean, the structural and decorative integrity of the monument was kept. And only its story was changed. On the other hand, we also know that Amanat went out of his way to make this an Iranian monument, in the sense that it's using 2,500 pieces of stone.
Right.
All the material comes from Iran itself. The lapis lazuli that is doing the beautiful sort of stone implants into the monument that sort of drives your eyes up to the top of the tower. The way that it incorporated Safavid and Seljuk elements, and also it's an extremely successful monument. I mean, you really enjoy visiting it. You go underground through the middle part, and then you work your way up, and as you're working your way up, you encounter incredible spaces of different kinds that works.
You were talking about this yearly ritual there where the revolution is remembered or celebrated, but Azadi Square has also in recent years become the site of new protests, this time against the current regime. It was the center of dissent, as I recall, following the 2009 Iranian elections, the physical focal point of the Green Movement opposition. Why do you think it keeps becoming the ground for historical and ideological battles?
I think for the same reason that it was the site for the original revolution. It's because of its urbanism, it's because of its architecture, it's conducive to protest. And also in 2009, the revolutionary memory was operational in the sense that the leaders of the 2009 protests, they knew that here on this site, a revolution happened that was successful. So there was a conscious effort to repeat the revolution,
right?
To protest and make that protest successful.
Talinn, how does this might be a difficult question to answer, but I'm sure you can give it a shot. How does a building become a symbol for a nation or for a peoples or for an era. In other words, as hard as the propaganda machine or the advertising execs may try, it occurs to me that, the Canadian government couldn't just pick a building now and say, okay, everybody, this is the way Canada is going to be defined. And yet the Maydan-e Shahyad or the Maydan-e Azadi or whatever we want to call it has become this shorthand, this mainstay of pop culture. It's like the shorthand. You want to talk about Tehran, you want to talk about Iran, if it's a TV program or if it's a film, ranging from, I remember that film, The Scent of Joseph's Shirt, where there's this whole scene, she arrives in Iran and there's the Azadi Tower, or Argo, you always see the Azadi Tower. Why do you think this building in particular has become the symbol in popular culture, and how does a building become that?
Any building, first and foremost, needs to be a good architecture. I mean, architecturally, it needs to be a high standard architecture to begin with. And also, it needs to be in a context where it is constantly visible, accessible, and in the case of Shahyad, it's like right there. I mean, you have to be blind to not see it. The moment you arrive,
there's no condos around it. It's a really sage point. It makes sense. You can see it.
Yes, exactly.
Right, yeah.
Just imagine, for example, one of the smartest things that IMP did when he was asked to design the Islamic Museum in a place like the Persian Gulf states, where every 5 minutes there's so much construction that the post office is unable to keep up with the addresses. Right. So the first condition he put, IMP, was that I want this building to be far away, actually a little bit out in the water, in order to preserve its integrity. So that then you don't end up with a bunch of high-rises around it, that in 10, 20 years, it's sort of suffocating in the middle of these high-rises. So one of the ways that Shahyad and Azadi has maintained its integrity is, first of all, its architecture, its context, its urban context, and the way that the Islamic Republic has not allowed further construction. I mean, I'm sure that's a very prime property, but it has not been built around. The second one is about discourse. That's very important. Any monument can be completely forgotten and then eventually neglected. And buildings, just like anything else, you have to care for them. And if not, they will fall apart. Yeah. The discourse about them, the official discourse, this is where patronage becomes so important, because buildings need money and need attention and need expertise. And so when there is a discourse around the monument like this one, it means that some authority, the state, some ministry, for them, the preservation of the monument is important to the preservation of the discourse around it. This is the monument of the revolution.
What do you mean by the discourse around it? I mean, just that people talk about it? What does it mean?
No. It means that there is a narrative, an official narrative about the monument that is constantly reinforced through performance, through publication, through dissemination, through textbook repetition of that narrative in textbook and education and media. And so then that it becomes a normative. Most young people in Iran, at least when I was doing research and writing on Shahyad, when I asked a young 17-year-old, I said, what do you think about that white tower near the airport? And she couldn't care less. She had no memory. She had no collective memory of it because she associated with the state. And at that moment, she didn't care about the state. She didn't care about these official discourses about the Republic, she just dismissed. She's like, who cares about the monument? I mean, there are like more important things like Ali McBeal, like whatever episode she was watching at the time.
Right. I was going to say it's a 90s reference, but yes.
Yes. It's a very 90s reference. But that's what she was interested in talking about to me. And she couldn't care less about the monument. So it's not just about the physicality of it, but what stories are being told about it and what kind of identities are being projected off of it. The Shahyad Azadi, the importance of it in my mind is that it's multiple layers of meaning. It's sort of the elephant, literally, is in the middle. You know, that story that all these blind people were touching an elephant, and one ends up touching the ear and thinks that it's some kind of a fabric. The other one touches the body and thinks it's a hefty wall. One of them is touching the tail and thinks it's some kind of a cord. So everyone, at the end, all of these people were touching the same elephant. They have a very different perception of it. I see Shahyad Azadi as that for the diaspora who has been away from Iran for 30 years. For them, it means the 1970s good life, which is very tragic because that good life is always in the past. But the discourse continues. I mean, you get wedding invitation with Shahyad on it. You get credit card with Shahyad on it.
Right.
You get all sorts of things with Shahyad on it. But that's the discourse that is created by the diaspora about one layer of the meaning of the monument. Then there is the revolutionary meaning that is revived again and again whenever there is an uprising. And then there is the official Islamic Republic narrative about it that is performed through these annual military parades. And also, actually, maybe the most honest one is the one where Shahyad Azadi has become a symbol of Tehran. In many venues, it is used by environmentalists and people who are concerned about poverty and shanty towns. You know, you have all these cartoons about where Shahyad or Azadi is depicted, but then addresses the pollution problem in Tehran. It addresses the shanty towns of Tehran. It addresses the gap between the rich and the poor. And so there's that aspect of it, is sort of the activist on the ground who care about something beyond politics or history
But you know, the real or one of the real teachable moments of this conversation for me has been that the ascendance of this building to this legendary symbolic status is that the architecture is integral to that. That's so interesting to me. In other words, if I hear you correctly through this conversation, even if we took the same space and the same acreage and the open space and the same revolutionary history and the same intent to do this as a paean to the Shah and the monarchy originally, etc., but that the building looked like the Sears Tower or something, that it wouldn't be the symbol that it is today.
You're absolutely right. Yes.
Well, you're absolutely right. You're agreeing with yourself because I'm just clarifying. But I see what you're saying, and it's very. I mean, it puts quite an onus on architecture for shaping our history, then, doesn't it?
Yes, and one thing that is important is that the education and the institutions that went into making this monument. I mean, Hossein Amanat is a byproduct of the late 60s, early 70s architectural culture in Iran that itself had gone through a number of revolutionary changes. It had gone through changes. When Tehran University was established in 1934, the fine arts faculty, which had both an architectural school and a fine arts school for sculpture and painting and other medias, was very important, and the head of it was André Godard, a French architect and the head of the archaeological services. So he created a curriculum that was very French, based on the L'École des Beaux-Arts tradition. But then when others other Iranians like Mohsen Foroughi or Seyhoun, they took over, they were adamant about making it an Iranian institution with Iranian priorities and sending students to Yazd and Kerman and other places for students to look at Iran's architectural history, not sort of look at Parisian blueprints. By the time Amanat was designing this building, we already see a local indigenous architectural culture and architectural design. And that's, I think, part of its success. And that's also part of why it wasn't destroyed, because ultimately it's a very Iranian monument, regardless of the political spectrum where you stand.
A final question to you. For an ancient country like Iran, it's a pretty new building. I mean, 1971 ain't that long ago, you know. If you were to guess, would you say that this building is going to sustain for centuries to come? Will it be something that is still the symbol of Tehran or Iran through new regime changes, through new governments, through new societies, peoples through the years?
I think every architect builds for prosperity, and especially every good architect builds for prosperity. So the hope is that, yes, it will. Structurally, it has proven itself to be enduring. I think if the planet survives.
Right. If the planet is still here, I should have started with that.
Yes.
Assuming the planet survives.
Yes, I think so, if I had to guess.
It's been a great pleasure talking to you, and so informative. And I suspected you would be the right person to talk to about this and to learn from, and you have been. I thank you so much for the time you've given us today.
Thank you, Jian. It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Talinn Grigor, a professor and chair of the Art History program in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of California, Davis. We reached Talinn in Davis, California today. This is full time for the Roqe series, The Contemporary History of Iran, Part 1. Check out our regular editions of Roqe and all things related at roqemedia.com. That's our website where you can link to episodes of Roqe, funnies, videos, outtakes, gallery, etc. roqemedia.com. Thanks to the amazing team who make Roqe Media happen. Producer Susan, Ponta the artist, fabulous Keon, Super Paris Saw, Sabi Roham, Alay Merdad, sponsorship Sean, Captain Reza, and Groovy Shaya. Thank you to all of you out there for supporting us and sharing our content. Please subscribe on any of our platforms if you've not done so already. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Jian Ghomeshi. Mizun Bashin.